Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so on that note, I think it's important that we return to a discussion of how these investigations were conducted and the type of evidence that led to the discovery of this massive fraud. One thing that is clear based on the testimony today is that this is not just a Minnesota problem. This is a warning sign for every state that it is administering large-scale programs using taxpayer dollars. And we need to get to the bottom of how to identify this type of fraud and prevent it from continuing to occur. So, Mr. Dexter, I'd like to go back to your testimony, both what you have shared with us already about your extensive background investigating and analyzing program fraud and the methods that you used to identify the theft of taxpayer dollars in this particular type of case. In your written testimony, you mentioned that case selection and investigations were begun in part by looking at funding data. And I am interested in how your office would use things like funding data, use statistics, and other information and evidence to begin to develop these cases.
Well, it wasn't hard to find the funding amounts. We looked at the centers that received CCAP funds, and then we listed them out. We had what was originally referred to as the top 100 list, and it was based off of centers receiving the most CCAP funding, and that was generated through the billing process and the people that administer the funds.
And when you looked at that list, did it turn out that there were certain facilities that were outliers in some way, either because they were receiving a larger amount of funding based on student population than appeared typical, or because of where they were located? Tell us how you identified which facilities warranted further review.
Well, when we started looking at the centers that were receiving the most funds, the investigators were each assigned cases, were assigned centers, and we first started looking into what the billing pattern was, or what the billing amount was, how many children were being billed at these centers, and we would have centers that were billing for 120 plus children, and looking at the different days and times, kind of establishing a pattern that just was outside the realm of a typical daycare center.
So in other words, you used objective data and evidence as the foundation to proceed further with your investigations.
Yes, in order to start the investigation, that's what we would begin with.
And in your experience, wouldn't you also say that that is the typical method or atypical method for beginning and analyzing a potential fraud case of any nature in any community?
Yes, because in order to do the investigation, you first have to find out if it warrants an investigation and to what extent that investigation would be.
And now, isn't it also correct, you mentioned in your testimony systemic weaknesses that allowed the large-scale fraud, even after you had developed substantial evidence that there was in fact fraud occurring, that there were institutional and systemic barriers that prevented you from successfully moving these cases through prosecution. And indeed, in your testimony, you note that in 2019, you chose to retire because the process had become so constrained that meaningful work was no longer possible. Tell us about the barriers and ultimately that profound frustration that led you to retire.
Well, when we were originally hired, when this unit was originally created and we were hired with the understanding that our job was going to be to investigate fraud and stop it. And as we proceeded through with that, it wasn't by our doing that it turned out that the centers we investigated were predominantly Somali, but once that was kind of brought out to light, the roadblocks that were put in front of us, being called racist, being called before these boards to be investigated, and basically it wound up turning us into auditors. We wound up just simply reviewing attendance records and matching them up with billing. There really wasn't a lot of substantial investigation anymore, and most of our cases wound up going before administrative hearings rather than criminal.
Which in the end allowed this pattern of conduct to continue to occur, did it not?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Chair recognizes